This is Keys to the Shop, episode 313, Coffee Education and Training with Michael Phillips of Blue Bottle Coffee. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it, and I would appreciate if you would subscribe to Keys to the Shop. All you need to do is press subscribe. Hit that button wherever you are listening to this podcast, and that is the best way to stay up to date with all of the episodes coming out from Keys to the Shop. And I would also ask that if you really love this show, if you love the content that you're hearing, please share these episodes, share the show of Keys to the Shop with somebody that you know that could really use the information. Now, on top of the podcast, Keys to the Shop also offers consulting. Keys to the Shop Consulting is where I get to work directly with you to help you avoid needless mistakes in your business and also to help you build foundations for success that are sustainable and will bring fulfillment and joy for you and your team. So whether you're just starting out or you are an existing operator, there's a lot of ways that Keys to the Shop can help you, whether that's remotely or on site, and I'd love to talk with you about what that might look like. So to set up a free discovery call, just email chris@keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS at keystotheshop.com. Now, Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Prima Coffee is not just providing you with world-class commercial coffee equipment, but their focus at Prima Coffee is to help you select the right equipment for your business. So whether you're looking for brewers, grinders, or espresso machines, or things like under-counter refrigeration for your new shop or you're upgrading, Prima is an incredible resource to help you get outfitted and supplied with the absolute best. They curate the best from all over the world. It's a great website, prima-coffee.com, and you can peruse that and see what they have on offer there. Keys to the Shop listeners get 5% off their orders when using the code KEYS5 at checkout. That's KEYS and the number 5 at checkout gives you 5% off. Again, visit prima-coffee.com/keys and use that code KEYS5 for 5% off. And if you're in the market for commercial coffee equipment, you want to work with the best, then you need to work with prima-coffee.com. This episode is also brought to you by the Barista Series from Pacific. The Barista Series is the standard for excellence in plant-based beverages worldwide. The best coffee bars, the best baristas prefer this because it's designed and tested by them, the world's best, so that no matter what you get from their complete lineup of plant-based beverages, you can expect it to stand up to the heat from steaming, have awesome texture for latte art, and be balanced in the cup. So the coffee is always the focus of the beverage, and it's a great experience for your plant-based customers. So check them out over at pacificfoodservice.com. Get it in your store and try it today. I believe your customers are going to love it, and you're going to be impressed too. So if you want to serve world-class plant-based beverages in your shop, then you need to be using the Barista Series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today we get to talk with somebody who I've had the pleasure of competing alongside way back in the day and has carved out quite a career in coffee. Today we are talking with Michael Phillips. Michael Phillips has worked in specialty coffee since 2006 and was a co-founder of the Los Angeles-based Handsome Coffee Roasters before joining Blue Bottle Coffee. And throughout his career, he has held director of training positions at Handsome Coffee, Intelligentsia Coffee, and Blue Bottle. His work at Blue Bottle evolved into supporting new cafe openings internationally and helping to launch cafes and new markets from Boston and DC to Tokyo and Seoul. He also holds 2 United States Barista Championship titles from 2009 and 2010 and 1 World Barista Championship title from 2010. His current role at Blue Bottle Coffee is as the Global Director of Education and Engagement, where he focuses on creating consumer-facing educational content. So obviously today we're learning from a master, somebody who has spent years having successes, making mistakes, learning and developing himself and others. And I'm excited to dive into that journey with him on the show today so that you can hear all of those things, and let it help shape the way that you view your own career, especially if you are somebody who wants to be an educator or a trainer in coffee. Michael is absolutely one of the world's best. And on top of that, he's just a great guy. And it's an honor to have him on Keys to the Shop. So without anything else from me, let's get right to the conversation. Here now is my interview with Michael Phillips of Blue Bottle Coffee. Well, Michael Phillips, how are you? Welcome to Keys to the Shop.
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. It is quite an honor to have you on. And, we've known each other for quite some time. I think the last thing that I remember, the last time I actually saw you in person was in 2008 at a regional competition that you had won.
The Glurbic, Great Lakes Regional Barista Competition. That's old school. People don't know about the Glurbic.
No, it was really cool, and just kind of staying in touch with your career ever since then. And at that point, you had already been quite accomplished. You have been all over the world for coffee and influencing scores of baristas, and not the least of which is the cafe experience at Blue Bottle most recently. But I mean, you've had a really accomplished career in coffee. So it's really cool to talk to you about all of that today, and especially focused in on cafe experiences and training. This is somewhat of an unfair question, I guess, to start out with, but I mean, there are obviously going to be highlights of everyone's career. So what are the highlights from your career that you believe have shaped you, have really influenced what you're about today as a professional?
I mean, I've those are kind words. First off, thank you. I have been incredibly fortunate. I've had an enormous amount of right place, right time kick in throughout my career. Just, getting to start at Intelligentsia when they had such a aggressive level of investment in baristas. But I think there are some things that are highlights and shaped me, and then there are other things that are highlights and other things that shaped me. The first U.S. Barista Championship that I won in 2009 is easily one of the peaks. That was I had won in 2008, maybe the last time we saw each other, in the regional, and I was on cloud nine and went to Minneapolis for the U.S. finals that year. Did pretty well, didn't make top six, but felt like there was some momentum year over year, had a strong team that I was working with. And then in 2009, I went into the regionals feeling some pressure, right? Feeling like I should be able to take this. And this was when Intelli was at full competition glory. Yeah. They swept first, second, and third in the West Coast. And we had a strong Chicago team as well. And we had instituted this policy that you had to place in the top 3 to be sent to the national event, which made sense for a company like that had so many people competing. But in any other shop, if you made top 6, you'd be pretty stoked and you would go to the US. So it was
right,
a little challenging, a little nerve-wracking. And I got to that regional and I did great in the first round, kind of retrospectively. I was in the lead in the first round, but then in the finals, the bottom sort of fell out, and I ended up taking 5th, which was for me devastating because I placed so much personal self-value in how I performed in these events at that time. It was really, really important to me, and placing 5th, well, a great finish, meant, at least initially, that I was not going to be able to go to Portland for the US that year. And I was just devastated afterwards, couldn't sleep because I had worked so hard on that particular run. And then eventually I just went to Doug and I was like, hey, please let me go. I will cover everything. I'll do what it's all on my tab. I just want to be able to go and compete. And, Doug's got varied reputations in the industry, depending on who you talk to. He's a very competitive guy, but there's also a compassionate side there. And he was absolutely, you should be in it. He got me my flight, which was which was nice. I ended up having to share a bed that was the spare bed for Jesse Krause, who was one of the other people that made it. It was just like kind of scrounging my way. So there was no expectation that I was going to do well. Everybody thought one of the West Coast contingent was going to take it. And I just, felt like I was along for the ride and glad to be there. And I had to compete all rounds, not placing, you didn't get a bye. So first round went, felt ecstatic. I was in love with the coffee that I had. And then I made it to the second, which I was hopeful for, but that felt good. And then after that round, it felt even better. And this is the first year they started doing competitions in the round, so there's seats on all sides and the machines right in the middle. And I remember the first time that I stepped out there, like there was an echo effect that would happen that I hadn't counted on, just by the way the speakers are set up and the microphone. And like there was 1,000% a deer in the headlights moment when I said, "Hello, judges." That I viscerally remember to this day, because it just sort of stunned me. I was like, my brain's not going to be able to function in this, but pulled it together. Second round went great, ended up in the finals along with the other 3 West Coast US baristas. Scott Lucy was in that. Chris Baca, I think, might have been the other one. So it's like heavy hitters at that time all around. And I'm just glad to be there. And it just like everything lined up that day. It was so magical. After I finished, they just opened up the floor and, people were coming on before any of the judging came out. And I just like pulled shots for an additional 20 to 30 minutes just because there was nothing else to do while calibration happened. And that was like one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. It just felt so good to be up there with so many of my favorite people making coffee. And then ultimately that was the first actual major title that I won. And it felt so magical because it was always a aspirational dream, like getting into coffee, reading Barista Magazine, and like seeing all of these people, seeing yourself, like all of these like just sort of legends in the industry back then, and then getting to serve them coffee and be among them at this amazing final event and have that level of validation, like really inspired me and encouraged me to like just push and take chances. So I think that's probably like, I'll remember that one even more than the World, honestly. Like there's such an emotional arc to it. So that is a highlight that also shaped me and, gave me some drive and confidence.
I like that example, especially because, first of all, I mean, obviously there's like so many things that you could choose to use as a highlight, but I like it because it was, something so deeply personal, especially you put yourself out there to go, you were just happy to be there. Things lined up, as you say, but also the fact that they lined up was due in no small part to your prior preparation and letting the work that you had done speak for itself. Like you were a little bit more relaxed in the process of being there because it had sort of been a false start, so to speak, at the first. So it really feels like the pressure that people put on themselves in competition sometimes could get in the way of actually doing well. And then, for your career after that, things obviously had, there was some changes that happened after you had won championships. And up until that point, I mean, what you had been at Intelligentsia and a trainer at Intelligentsia, right, in education. And after the Worlds, what was it that you ended up looking at in terms of how you wanted your career to take shape and what you wanted to do with the knowledge and skills that you had?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of turned into a little bit of an out of control train. Like I've never been like a super confident ladder climbing alpha kind of, I'm just gonna go get it sort of guy. Like grew up in the Midwest. You get a compliment, the first thing you do is apologize. I was just happy to be on the team at Intelligentsia because it was such a well-renowned company, and there's so many like absolute icons working there, like Jeff Watts and Amber Sather and Matt Riddle and like all these guys back in the day that just were so well known for doing great stuff. I didn't ask for things, but I was lovingly rewarded. By the time the first U.S. Championship happened, I was still a bar barista at the Broadway Cafe. I mean, I was the trainer, but the format back then is you had an in-store trainer. So I would have 20 hours for training for that team and then 20 hours on shifts. After Atlanta, when I took third at the Worlds, then I moved into being the assistant director of training. Stephen Morrissey was heading up the training program. So I worked with him and Charles Babinski and Kyle Glanville, like just kind of shaping what was happening there. But after the Worlds, that's when Stephen moved into some other marketing aspects at Intelligentsia, and I stepped into the training program as the head of it. And it was such an exciting opportunity because like in my mind, that was the peak. Like that was the job. That was like whatever, like early on in my career, I thought I wanted to be a roaster and all these other things. But then once I got into the cafes, I knew like training was the thing that drove me. And I just wanted to have a chance to control all the levers and, really like bring a vision to life for what training staff could look like. And Intelligentsia gave me that opportunity. It was magical.
What was it about training that you said you wanted to like control all the levers and see something come to reality? Was that, I mean, you talked about how you're not like trying ladder climbing and all this stuff, but that was an aspirational element to what you wanted to do with your career. So, I mean, was that something that's always been the case for you? But what about training made it the place?
Well, it's funny. Do you know the Good Life podcast? Jonathan Fields. It's it's in this genre of self-work that's so prevalent. It's a podcast in that field, and the guy just came out with a book called Sparked, and it's sort of like a Briggs Myers, like what's your persona sort of thing, but very well researched and sourced. And I worked my way through this, but turns out I am what they call a maven maker. So mavens are people that live to learn. And makers, of course, love to build things, and it absolutely made sense after I read that and I looked throughout my life, both personally and professionally, like learning has always been something that's fascinated me. So once I got into coffee, there's just so much to learn. But then as you start to get into a cafe, the idea of like really building and understanding a system that allows us to share great coffee experiences, and like the challenge that comes into that, from the technical elements to the people elements to the atmosphere, like there was so much to work on with that the idea of being able to create a training program to help build and refine and hopefully achieve new levels that exceed what we were capable of in the past was like, it was intoxicating. And honestly, I definitely went too far, I think.
How so?
Well, we created, and it was not just me. This was all like a magical era of collaboration. I've always been fortunate to be surrounded by great people. So working with Stephen and Kyle and Charles on all of this, we built this training program that we dubbed the Matrix. It was just over the top, like because back in those early days, I was not anywhere near as pragmatic as maybe I've become now. And my goal for a training program was like the MIT of coffee. just like ultimate coffee college. All right, we're going to teach you everything, and we're going to give you drills, and we're going to have tests, and we're going to have resources, and it's going to be 9 months before you can pull a shot of espresso, and 2 years before you're fully certified. And it was way too intense, for so many reasons, but the biggest one being the practicality. So we had an in-store trainer and a cafe leader, and we made the decision to have those positions be kind of parallel, right? So it was like a power sharing agreement, which in retrospect I think was a horrible idea because it just created a power struggle. There wasn't a clear leader for the cafe. Like the trainer would always be pushing for more training, and the cafe leader would be like dealing with numbers and pushing for lower labor. And there's this inherent tension to it. And those poor cafe leaders, if they lost somebody, like it took forever for that person to get to the point where they were considered certified and capable of doing the things that cafe leader needed functionally done on the floor. Like, yeah, it was a fun and intense coffee program, but like back then, especially, like we were mistaken. Like the goal isn't to come here and become a PhD of coffee. The goal is to come and make great coffee experience for guests. So like those early days were much more internally focused,
so little
on ourselves. Yeah, no, and almost absolutely self-serving, as opposed to like, all right, what's actually going to make our guests have a wonderful time in our cafe? How are we supporting that versus supporting our own interest? Are you making coffee for them, or are you making coffee for you?
That is ultimately one of the most prevalent defaults of trainers and educators, is balancing the desire to sort of make like you say, this program, or essentially turns into making a case for their legitimacy as a trainer. And almost like this proof of who they are, how much they know, and shock and awe in coffee. When you create something like this, I mean, what was the problem that you were trying to solve by the creation of this training program versus other training programs? Like, what were the improvements meant to address that you saw there was a lack in the industry maybe?
There's so much we take for granted now. The idea that the level of consistency and quality of execution you can get in cafes today is mind-blowing compared to what it was in like 2006. So coming at it from, because I actually like did things a little backwards. I came into the cafes after having competed for a year. Right. So I started on the production floor, was thinking I was going to go the roaster route, got involved in competitions as a way to learn, and then realized, I like making coffee better than putting beans in bags, and moved into the cafes. And when I did that, I had this like super meticulous mindset of like, all right, this is what cappuccino has to be like. This is what a shot of espresso has to be like, that crashed headlong into the reality of crutchingly busy specialty coffee shop in that era. I felt like the standards were too loose, and like finding a way to white knuckle the consistency that I was able to achieve in the controlled environment of competition into being inside of a cafe. Like that was the goal. It was all around coffee quality and consistency, and like, how do you achieve that with this broadcast of characters that it is every cafe, right? There's so many different personalities and skill levels. How do you wrap them all up into something that makes the coffee that you want served in your cafe? And the hope was that this incredibly diligent, long, hard training program would get us there. And, for a lot of people it did. For other people it didn't. Like that program made people cry. Like the testing components were brutal. And I just didn't realize it. I didn't know enough. I felt like book learning and teaching, and like the pressure component was what would bring out the highest level in everybody, and that's just 1,000% wrong. But I had to crash that car before I realized it.
You are reminding me of I've said it on the show before, the incidents where I would show up in the early years of Gimme Coffee in the middle of a rush with a clipboard. And
yeah.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I was so ignorant.
Clipboard and a timer.
Yeah. It's like, oh, well, believe me, this might hurt, but it's for your own good, okay? Not really a recipe for sustainable growth and really the outcomes that you want to see, that you are purporting to want to produce. And so it really is a process of learning as you go. So now, as you kind of learned that about the program, and you spent those years at Intelligentsia sort of growing in maturity as a educator, as a trainer, and seeing these things take shape. The next step, you took the entrepreneurial route and you started Handsome Coffee. And what kind of elements of training and education did you take from your experiences at Intelligentsia and infuse into the concept of Handsome?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know that I didn't learn while I was at Intelligentsia or even shortly thereafter that program didn't work. Like, that had not yet resonated with me. If anything, I was full of hot air because I just won this world championship, and in my mind that validated this like hard work, drive, really rigorous format for education as being a good thing. But the thing that saved me was, once you leave the comfort and structure of something like Intelligentsia was at that point in time, and you jump into the entrepreneurial world, you got to figure a bunch of stuff out really quick. And, you can't have these academic ideals that aren't grounded in reality because you have to open a cafe tomorrow. I was actually responsible for making stuff work. So that forced my hand a little bit, just to change what I was doing out of a practical need. But then we were also, we were a small team. Handsome was only one cafe, and we were lucky enough to pull in some pretty big guns. Tyler and Chris were excellent baristas in their own right. Nicely was part of that starting team. We had a handful of other really talented folks. So at Handsome, it was some of my favorite training because it was just one-on-one. It wasn't a barista factory. We didn't have to like crank out people nonstop. I was able to just get solid one-on-one time with people and walk them through pulling shots, walk them through pouring in a way that was really great. It formed some wonderful relationships, and I honestly think like that is some of the best training that you can do, is that one-on-one in person on bar, that's more bespoke and tailored, and you're responding to where they're at. But that was more a forced change by the context than an actual mental evolution in what training should be. That didn't really happen for me until Blue Bottle.
Okay, so how did that take place then? Because I know now the location of Handsome is now a Blue Bottle, and you've been at Blue Bottle now for quite a while. At what point did that change start to happen? Was it shortly after the sale of Handsome to Blue Bottle, or when you were deeper into your role as the director of training for Blue Bottle?
Definitely deeper into it, because in a lot of ways, when I started working at Blue Bottle, it's like, okay, this is familiar. This makes sense. We've got a couple of big markets, not too many cafes. It was only like 4 or 5 cafes in the Bay and 4 or 5 in New York when the acquisition happened. So it was a bigger scale than Intelligentsia, but it felt similar. And I like set about to making this really structured segmented process with different modules and time frames and tests and all that stuff. And it wasn't until probably about a year and a half in, as Blue Bottle was growing, they started to pull in some tech people for different like general and administrative functions. And the person that I was reporting into was in our people operations department, this gentleman named Jevin Sue. And he came from Square, and then he hired someone called a gentleman named Michael Matteries, who had time at Apple and Tesla, and like they just had this wealth of experience that you can get in those companies around what people development should look like, and they opened my eyes to it. And that's when I really dramatically started to change things. Thinking about the 10-20-70 rule and looking at what real retention is versus just memorization. It's such a bummer that I came to it so late in training. The idea is that for the actual real retention of knowledge, only about 10% of it is going to come from coursework. So in a classroom, talking teacher right in front of you, telling you about the stats and the details and assigned reading and things like that. And then your next 20% is going to come from sort of those developmental relationships that you build. So getting to be alongside someone as they coach you through it and actual hands-on work there. But that 70% that really locks things in and builds your habits, that's kind of just coming from doing the work. Like that 70% typically happens in cafe, on bar, without someone watching over you. And I had that all backwards. I was doing 70% like, okay, we're going to be in the lab. I'm going to talk to you about extraction. You're going to work on your leveling. You're going to figure out like what happens at different parts of the shots and steaming, all this stuff. And that was a very front heavy training structure approach for so long. But as they started introducing these concepts, I realized that I needed to shift that up and trying to come up with ways to extend that training to be more so in cafe, finding guidance there, knowing that the lab itself is not going to be the complete answer. It's not even going to be 50% of the answer. So that was a real eye opener for me.
Well, that's a logistical challenge too, to have multiple locations where, I mean, you had been one-on-one teaching people how to pull espresso at Handsome, and now there's this, there's a lot of shops to manage, and you're building out a process that has to create consistency across the board. If you're relying on that 70% in the lab, that's a lot of work. It's probably a recipe for burnout right there, but also, kind of not being effective in the retention of the information, just like you said. So what I imagine that in order to make that work, you need to delegate to other people instead of, Michael is the one that you talk to for all Blue Bottle employees, like get trained by Michael. Was there a phase where that was true, or how did the structure actually start where it made it possible to disseminate the information and also get that hands-on doing the work coaching time?
Delegation was so hard for me. I've come to love it. It's my favorite tool because it makes my life easier and makes other people's work more fulfilling. But early on, it was tricky. I mean, we had some great trainers at Blue Bottle when I joined. There was like 3 up in the Bay and 2 or 3 in New York. And I was working with them in a really like close way to build out the program and to make sure that everybody came through, but it was still very centralized. And it was finding ways to try and leverage the lead barista roles that we had in cafe to pick up where the lab left off. That was a challenge, and it's still a challenge. I mean, it's very nobody has training, right? You waffle back and forth between centralized versus localized. Centralized, you can have far more rigid adherence to standards, and you make sure that source of truth is very clear and well known. But you lose that 70%, right? That they're gaining in cafe no matter what. That whole, I'm guessing you've heard this before, where you've got a training program and baristas go through it, and then they get to the cafe, and the first thing they hear is, yeah, no, we don't do it that way. We do it this way.
Yes, of course.
It's like figuring out how to combat that, because that's everywhere. I haven't run into a coffee company that has a centralized structure that doesn't have to figure out how to address that. And I don't think we have it perfect, but I feel like we've come a long way. It's the Sisyphean battle where you just have to keep investing in people all the time. You never get to a point where training's done. Training needs to be part of a culture. It can't just be a box that's checked.
I agree. Yeah, and you're right. That is kind of a ubiquitous feature of working in coffee bars, no matter how big or small. And even if you have a lot of resources and capital to throw at the problem, if you're starting from the wrong assumptions and values, then you probably are going to be chasing your tail, putting out fires and all that stuff. So, I mean, as you start to delegate and you start to see that, the goal here is to facilitate the success of these trainers in the location itself so that they can create the kind of consistency that you want. You have to disseminate some kind of information from your position. Like, there's so many things you could focus on in helping the trainers in the organization, like subjects. Is it, with espresso quality, with coffee quality, with hospitality standards? I mean, how do you choose what to focus on so that it makes its way down the levels so that a barista in any of the cafes has a reasonably good understanding of what is expected of them according to what Blue Bottle wants to see happen in the coffee shop?
Jeez, Chris, why do you come with the hard hitters? No, it's so hard because there's a lot of times I get wrapped up in trying to build a complex system because I see problems and I'm like, I can see like all the different challenges that go into it, and I'm like, there's no simple answer. You need to account for all these different variables, but you can't build a complex system and have it function well. The best complex systems evolve out of simple systems that are built, tested, and stacked on top of each other. So I think for a cafe trying to figure out how to approach this, you gotta get your table stakes down first. You need really clearly defined standards. And you need to have a source of truth that keeps those honest, that everybody can access. So when I first joined, you had a very strong culture in the Bay and a very strong culture in New York. And they both served Blue Bottle coffee, but they did it a little bit differently. And then even inside of the markets, you would have one cafe that had a culture and an approach, and another cafe that had a different culture and approach. And some of them were closer to what we wanted, and some were further apart. So some of those early things is just getting very detailed. What are the drink specs? What are the processes? How do we dial in? And having agreement amongst ourselves as a training team was that first layer. And then it came down to, all right, well, now that we've agreed upon it, how do we share it? Who do we share it with? Who do they share it with? How do you build in this system? And, this is where the smaller the team, the better in terms of ease for this process being successful. Like, that's why Handsome was such a breeze, because I would see personally every member of that team multiple times a week, and I would see the drinks they're making. It's just once you start to get more distributed, how do you create that culture of accountability and support for one another that doesn't drift into personal preference, but adheres to that one source of truth? So defining is the first thing, and then figuring out the best way to share it with people, I think is the next. There's a lot of approaches to that now when you've got like LMS, online learning management systems. whether it's like a binder under the counter, whether it's regular check-ins. Um, it's again like that challenge of n- never feeling like it's done,
Right.
because there's that whole Danny Myers, you always got to move that salt shaker back to the
I
middle.
love it. Yes, I'm so glad you brought it to Danny Meyer, because the I was thinking there is a certain level of trust you have to have in people, and that will fuel their engagement in the process of adhering to standards, while at the same time giving trust to people runs the risk of, and often is just inevitably going to move that salt shaker some direction, because people are people, not because they're bad people or they're bad hires even. It's just because that's the nature of something, especially as it gets bigger, right? And if you're focused on this narrow set of stuff, now it feels like you're talking about extraction. You're talking about, this is how we pull shots, how we do milk. And in a company that size at that time, it's like you have to think about all the other stuff you want to say and just not say it, or at least have a plan for when you're when you're going to say it. So I imagine there's a lot of self-control that you have to have, and patience in the process of waiting until that first simple layer actually solidifies so it can bear the weight of the next one. I mean, how long did it take before you were able to add another layer of complexity onto that first layer that you instituted?
I wish it were clean and cut and dry, but we didn't necessarily wait, didn't have entirely the option to wait. Like there's always multiple things happening at once. So like, getting the drink standards done was one part of it, but then also, um, James, it's funny, like, so James Freeman, founder of Blue Bottle, um, is he's an incredibly talented, wonderfully unique human being. And his approach to coffee and my approach to coffee probably couldn't have been more different back then, because I am a standards, rule book, guides, information, and takes a far more spiritual approach. Like one of his huge influences was Japanese kissetans, which are like, 15 minutes slow drip Nell style coffee cups that like fly in the face of a lot of what I had held sacrosanct back then in terms of TDS and brew ratios and things like that. So the culture was still very much uh, kind of artisan and craft. They were using drip rails. They didn't have scales. They didn't have refractometers in place. It was a more hands-on approach. They were still doing almost some element of that Hansen style of training. So getting the equipment dialed in was a big first step. So creating the ability to have metrics in place, because as you scale, if you are looking to be a company that has, I would say even beyond 5 is when you start to see the ability for those more one-on-one training formats really fray, because you just need that consistency that everybody can have access to, and having equipment that supports that. So being able to measure your flow rate and your time and your number of pours and your patterns, and having clearly defined weights for all those different stages, and being able to give people TDS targets to dial into, and then also like finding ways to build this into what is a very fast moving company. We had very busy shops. So, what is a grinder solution that allows for precise dose and good adjustment, but doesn't slow down this process that was developed? Like the change management around that was a little tricky, but it set the foundation, again, creating those simple systems in the execution side that allowed you to build training systems that could stack on top of it, because you now had this very measurable, easily communicated process. So that was a big first step, that kind of came before, but also alongside of some of the more functional training.
How do you know it's working? I mean, even today, I guess it'd be a question I'd love to know in terms of your connection to the performance of staff and the experience of the cafe and the coffee quality. Like, how do you stay in touch with whether or not it's taking?
I mean, it's hard. You know it when you see it. Is that? I've again, my time at Blue Bottle, very fortunate. Amazing experiences have been offered to me. I've been able to launch new cafes and markets all over the world, and like seeing coffee made in these cafes in person and having a cup of our Bella Donovan blend in Tokyo and saying, yeah, that is the same extraction and strength as what I got last week in New York at a Rockefeller cafe. So, nothing makes up for actually being out there in person, seeing, tasting, talking to the teams to evaluate whether or not a program is successful. You can put in other metrics. We had like a coffee logging system where, as the baristas dial in and cafe in the morning, they input the setting and the tasting notes and the TDS that they got out of it into a centralized platform, and our QC team could see that and say, all right, looks like things are in place, or this cafe seems to be drifting a little bit high, and send someone out to check on that. So those sorts of systems are helpful, but nothing makes up for getting in there yourself or having members of your training team visit cafes and taste coffees, doing check-ins.
Yeah, and I guess having trust in their ability to be basically representing or looking for the same kinds of things as you do. So you have a smaller team that's multiplying the effect of being there in person, right? So you have to trust all of these people that are delegated as your eyes and ears, especially.
Yeah, and the calibration, it's so much trickier. I mean, if you think about how much effort we put into trying to calibrate a table of cuppers, right? To say, okay, this is a 84-point coffee, or this is an 86-point coffee, or so much work goes into that, and then extrapolate that to a whole cafe. You're not just assessing the score of coffee, but how clean do they keep it? Are they engaging with guests? How quick are the drinks coming out? Is everything stocked? Is the latte art up to standard? Is the second espresso dialed in well? Like, there's so much to see, and then finding a way to create common standards that your entire team can lean on. I guess that was one of the later evolutions, is like trying to codify what that looks like and create a guide that the teams could work off of to assess it.
So how do you do that? Create a guide for assessment. Then and now, as you've held the positions of director of cafe experience and now of coffee culture, and both of these things are including being respectful to the culture itself, having with respect to a certain market that you're in, because you're in a global market now as Blue Bottle. From when you started until now, a lot has changed. Maybe some things have remained the same, but the reach is far greater. When it comes to the stable standards versus the cultural, being flexible with culture, how do you manage that, and how does that look when you enter a new market?
Honestly, it was so much easier than I anticipated. It really, the experience of opening new markets really reinforced for me that the experience of coffee transcends language. It is an international language that we can all speak somewhat easily. I helped launch our first international market in the Kiyosumi district in Tokyo in Japan. Mm-hmm. And so I was out there, trained that whole staff, and didn't speak a lick of Japanese, but we were the process of brewing and pulling shots and pouring and bar flow I mean, so much of that is nonverbal. It was easier than expected. And also by that point in time, when we launched that market, we had just finished so much of that foundational work, right? In determining drink standards and how we assess in cafe and what our coaching strategies are like for different positions on the floor. We've been doing a lot of that incremental work, building up those stacks so that by the time we went in for Tokyo, I had all of that at hand. I had a slew of Google Docs that we got translated, and the team was able to pick it up pretty quickly and efficiently, and that saw that replicated everywhere we went, from Boston to DC to Seoul to Hong Kong. Having that playbook well defined and then practiced over and over with each new cafe. The cultural aspects, while they were there, they weren't necessarily a challenge as much as like a happy surprise. Like seeing how the teams worked in each market was interesting, but not necessarily something where it's like, all right, we have to shift our extraction for this market, or we need to add different drinks for this market, or the approach to how we make coffee and how we interact with our guests has been remarkably consistent.
When you open a new shop in a market, and no matter where it is, I guess, what's your expectation for it to go from infancy to maturity in terms of, we can have really good confidence that they're producing an experience for the guest that is right in line with what we want people to walk away with?
I mean, we want it to feel like a Blue Bottle the day the doors open.
Mm-hmm.
The main thing that we hope that changes over that first sort of 3-month seasoning period isn't that the drinks get better, it's that the relationships form. The baristas have been doing a good job interacting with the guests as they come in, and they start to develop that familiarity and that sort of interaction that creates the magic of a cafe space. But in terms of the standard of drinks, we've invested in having people support cafe openings. We have a whole team dedicated to it, new cafe opening department. So we make sure that we have people on the ground that are aiding that process to help ensure that experience is right where we want it. Certainly some cafes will open a little bit more smoothly than others, but in general, we want it to feel good from day one.
How would you describe the feeling? I mean, in terms of if I'm going into a Blue Bottle, what should I be walking away with as a guest when it comes to everything from how I'm treated and the coffee and everything?
Welcoming everyone is a core principle for us. So, I mean, the number one thing we want to have resonate with our guests is that Blue Bottle is a space where they should feel accepted and comfortable and welcome to enjoy a delicious cup of coffee. So that's probably number one. You should be coming away with that it is a delicious experience. Hopefully that is always paramount for us, and that is a human experience, that there's an interaction there. When we had the initial days of the transition, so I'm steeped in everything we were doing at Handsome and trying to figure out how to integrate that with Blue Bottle. Handsome was a batch brew exclusive coffee shop, and Blue Bottle was like the peak of artisanal hand brews, right? Mm-hmm. That was a big shift for me to accept, because I was like, technically speaking, you can get a perfect extraction in a batch brew even more easily than you can in a hand brew. The numbers are better, blah, blah. I was very caught up in that side. And James didn't disagree with that you could get a delicious cup of coffee in a batch brew, but the personal scale of brewing each cup by hand and the interaction that goes along with it, and the opportunity for transcendence that comes out of that sort of more human interaction, that was what defined the experience at Blue Bottle, and that was what we wanted to hold on to. And it's still something that we hold on to. We've changed the way we make pour overs, but it's still a by the cup experience that is designed to allow us that level of interaction and that sort of moment of connection with our guests.
I love that. I want to ask this because I think a lot of people have had their opinions and thoughts about the acquisition of Blue Bottle by Nestle and the idea of the human experience and the personal experience when you're as large as you are. And then when you've got a company as large as Nestle in the mix, right? It doesn't necessarily make you think immediately, oh, yeah, a genuine like human to human contact, special experience. It seems like you would have to overcome some kind of assumption, at least with people that know that about the company, that you have to overcome that assumption that it isn't there. So I wonder if you'd speak to that a little bit. I mean, how much really changed as a result of acquisition? Do you find it as necessary to sort of work harder to make those connections and those experiences in the face of being such a large brand?
Honestly, from my perspective, so before Nestle was involved, Blue Bottle was already a fast-growing company. We'd taken multiple rounds of investment. I believe the last one before Nestle was a $120 million round of fundraising from a bunch of different folks. So like there was already that atmosphere of our goal is to grow and bring delicious specialty coffee to everyone that is looking for it. From my perspective, it was honestly a little bit more stressful before Nestle, because it was always a question of like, all right, we're aiming to grow. We want to move into these markets. We've got this much money to do it. We'll figure out what we're doing after that. Maybe we raise another round. Maybe we work with these folks or these folks. And it was always sort of an open question, what was happening in the future and like how we were working with those investors that we had. Once Nestle bought out those other investors to become a part of Blue Bottle, it kind of took that question off the table. It's like we lived in a house rather than constantly moving to different apartments. If that makes sense. Like it let the financing question like fall to the wayside, and we're able to focus on opening cafes and improving our processes and all of that. And in terms of internal changes, there was none of note that I ever saw impacted. We had a couple of Nestle team members join the board, and James was on it, and Brian Meehan, another great figure of Blue Bottle, was there, and they would meet with them 4 times a year, and that was the level of interaction. Now recently it's gotten a little bit more integrated. I still have very minimal interaction with anyone from the Nestle side. No one's telling us what coffees to buy. No one's telling us how to operate our cafes. So it still feels like it's something that operates in the background that just lets us be more effective. But it's the kind of thing that people are right to look at and pay attention to and ask questions. We have to be diligent about assessing how we spend our money, who we spend it with, and what we're supporting. But for my part, they've let us be an amazing coffee company, and there's been some really beautiful upstream impacts as well. So sustainability is an incredibly important thing for us at Blue Bottle. James and Brian were huge promoters of that. All of our blends in the US are organic, and we're working on a carbon neutral pledge. There's been a lot of like actual investment behind that. And as Brian worked out this acquisition, he's actually moved into board positions inside of Nestle, pushing them further on sustainability in terms of packaging and trying to have an impact outside of Blue Bottle to bring that company some of the ideas and values that we've held. And that's been very positive as well.
As you talk about living in a home versus moving from apartment to apartment and not having to worry about that money component, it's coming from, the way I see it is that it's coming from this point in your career where almost the same. It's almost the same as what it was like at Intelligentsia, where you weren't necessarily the one in charge of the money,
Yeah.
but it was there. It was like this buffer, you know.
Yeah.
And you had carte blanche almost on what you wanted to do. Here you have authority to create change, yet you've learned all these lessons and you're using that opportunity, that stability, in quite a different way.
Much more so. And it's not like there's a money faucet in the break room that we just go and turn on when we need a new machine or something. Yeah, I know it's crushing dreams here, but yeah, we still have to be responsible. We still have to try and run a balanced, profitable business. All of those things are very important. We just have the opportunity to take chances in a way that we didn't necessarily before. And it's like we're not constantly campaigning. We're able to focus on the work. But also, having had the background of running my own cafe for a while, I became much more pragmatic in realizing that, all right, we have our ideals of what coffee education and execution can be, but they need to align with a business direction. We have to make sure we're sustainable, not just in our environmental footprint, but in our financial footprint and our work-life balance footprint. Like, that's one other thing, just maybe it's a side topic here, that has built up inside of me over the years of training and cafe work, is that we're often very quick, if we move into a training position or a leadership position, to set standards for other people and say, this is how it should be done. Mm-hmm. Make sure you do it this way. And this is how this other thing should be done. Make sure you do it this way. And we create this ideal version that only a superhuman could actually achieve. We build a system and a structure with targets that exceed the capability of mortals, and then when people don't hit those goals, we're like, well, we told you what the standards were. It was like this. You should have been doing X, Y, and Z. And people just feel horrible, and they come up with workarounds to keep the doors open, keep the coffees going out that maybe don't meet those standards, but then they feel bad for not meeting. It's all too easy, if you're not actually paying attention to what the real impacts are, to build something that feels unsustainable. And I think we do that a lot in specialty coffee. So that's one of the things that I've tried to be much more aware of as I've grown inside of Blue Bottle. Is like, all right, we want this to happen in training. We want this to happen in cafe, but we also realize that cafe leader has to do inventory. They have to do reviews. They have to do all these other things. We need to make sure that we're setting up something that people can actually achieve and feel good about.
That perspective is definitely one that is putting people first. It's that people first system that is kind of, it's necessary for you to be patient with your own desires. Like you were talking about earlier, you've got to have these simple systems that are stacked, and it's easy to overcomplicate it. It almost feels like people do that. People create these unsustainable systems because they feel like if they don't, then they're not challenging people, or they're not going to move the industry forward. They're not going to, it's just going to be, everyone's going to be lazy, or I'm just going to forget about it. So I need to put it all out there now. I guess from your perspective, how do we create a mindset in ourselves that really is a people first mindset, so that everything that we're responsible for just kind of naturally flows into something that is achievable?
Well, first we need national health care that takes care of therapy. It's hard. It's a lot of self-work. You need to get to a point where you have a generous assumption about people. Like, nobody comes into work wanting to make bad coffee and leave a mess everywhere. One other training concept that I love is sort of an idea around how to assess when and how things are going wrong. Is it a knowledge gap? Is it a skills gap? Or is it a mindset gap? Right. So a knowledge gap would be someone pulls a shot of espresso and it's 36 grams out instead of the recipe that you had set for 32. And they pull it to 36 because they didn't know, right? So that's a knowledge gap. You assess that. You simply tell them, oh, actually 32 grams is our target. And they're like, okay, let's do that. Then you have a skills gap where they simply can't manage bar flow well enough to stop the shot when they need to. And you need to do some hands-on coaching to help them develop that ability to get to the point where they are able to manage all of the technical aspects and stop the shot when they know they need to. And then last, you have that mindset gap where they know it should be 32. They could do it, but they don't see the value in it. They're like, the shot tastes the same to me. I just don't care about that particular aspect enough. I don't see the value in it, so I'm executing a different way. That is the hardest one to shift. And that comes down to the culture and making sure you're communicating what is important, what is valuable to you and your team, so that they can understand why standards are the way they are. And I think that's where a lot of cafes fall short in this regard. Is maybe they've gotten to the point where they've built those simple systems for knowledge transfer and skill development, but they don't lean as heavily into creating that shared value for teams that gets everybody onto that same page and helps them achieve that goal and feel good about it, as though it's the right thing to do and not just something they're being told to do, but they don't necessarily understand why.
I love that framework. The culture part of it is also it's caught. They say caught, not taught. Nature, nurture, all that. It really does boil down to, like, are you as the manager or the trainer, is that kind of something that you're focused on demonstrating yourself from the very outset in the onboarding process, in the materials? Is a consistent through line that everybody is just like really steeped in that culture of caring? Or are you just hoping that somebody just imports that into the company for you instead of just having it as a foundation of the company?
Yeah. The more time I'm in this industry, the more I realize how much companies are, for better or for worse, a reflection of that leadership. That caring has to come from the top. And that's one of the things that's been great about Blue Bottle, is like James cares immensely about coffee, about experience, but also about people. And that has shown up in the people that we've hired and the way we've developed them and who we give power to and how we work with diversity and inclusion and all of those things, in a way that I think is really one of the secret strengths that we have as a company.
Love it. As we wrap up here, I have a last question for you right now in the industry, because we're undergoing a lot of stuff. We've gone through some pretty hard times, and yet I think there are probably things that are happening that are good. And as well, what brings you the most hope and joy from your perspective as you look out to the industry, specifically with like retail coffee? Where are you most hopeful?
I mean, it's easy to get overwhelmed. I am a voracious consumer of news, watching, listening, reading, just nonstop throughout the day, to a point where I should probably dial it back, honestly. And it can feel very dark and disconnected, if that's part of your process, and I feel like I'm probably not alone in that. But where I've been finding hope and joy has just come from getting back out there, and of course, healthy, responsible ways with masks and being vaccinated and keeping distance and whatnot. But like going out and seeing people in cafes again. I know this has been such a tragic year, and we've lost a lot of really wonderful cafes. But there's still so much heart in the community and so many people doing good work. And I think that theme of care and investing in people, people over coffee, has become far more prevalent. There's some beautiful cafes that are doing that here in LA, and getting out there and seeing that, seeing them be able to not just survive but thrive in this environment, has been great. It's inspired me. I just started a little cupping club here in LA. If you're ever in LA, you got to stop by.
Oh, fun.
Just getting coffee professionals together to taste coffee. And, knowing that things like this, that people coming together and connecting and whatnot, is still something we can do. It's a little bit different now, but it still provides that fuel and that energy that I think is a key part of what makes our industry as special as it is. And it's not gone. It's there. You just have to look for it, and you have to foster it when you can.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you being on the show. It's been fun to hear your perspectives and, a little bit more about how you've been impacting the industry for these many years. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. How can people stay in touch with you and Blue Bottle, and maybe even join you for a cupping in LA?
Oh yeah, I would love it. So I'm not active on a ton of social media. I sort of fell away from Twitter and never got into Facebook, but my Instagram is alive and well. One Shot for the Road, the number 1, the number 4. I'll post there. That's where I'm posting stuff for the cupping club as well. So if you're in LA and you're a coffee professional and you want to get in on that, just shoot me a DM with your email and I'll add you to the list when we come out with dates. If you want to see some of the stuff that I'm working on at Blue Bottle, my current role is guest facing video content, so you can check out the Blue Bottle YouTube channel. We got a lot of good stuff on there, and those are the ways to see what's happening in my world. And thank you for this, Chris. Like I said, I've been listening to the podcast over this last year, and it's really nice to have just a warm, approachable voice to share some of the things about coffee that a lot of people don't always talk about in a way that feels helpful and tactical and functional, and without like a lot of noise in the signal. Good job on that. You're providing real service to the community.
Oh, I really appreciate that, Michael. Thank you so much. And again, thanks for being on the show and contributing your voice to the community here.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, everybody. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation and that it gave you some insights on how to approach developing training systems, developing people within those training systems. And, one of the things we can definitely walk away with here is the idea that we have to allow for flexibility in the systems that we create. Going from Michael's original iteration of the matrix that he and others created was highly idealistic and very rigid, to today where he has so much success with the programs that he's put in place, but through the process of learning and maturity and things like that, it is allowed for flexibility and a more human approach to training and education. Being a people-focused industry, we need to make sure that whatever we're creating sets people up for success and is not just an exercise in getting our ideals down on paper. So a huge thank you to Michael Phillips for joining us on the show today and sharing all of your hard-earned wisdom with us. If you want to get in touch with what Michael is up to, the best way to do that is to follow him on Instagram. That's One Shot for the Road, and that is the number 1 and the number 4. One Shot for the Road on Instagram. And of course, check out the Blue Bottle Coffee YouTube channel. We'll have links to all this in the show notes, of course. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about this show or any of the other episodes of Keys to the Shop, then please send me an email, chris@keystotheshop.com. That is also where you can reach me if you're interested in working with Keys to the Shop Consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. And one of the places that you can go to be trained and educated in coffee is Coffee Fest. Go to coffeefest.com and explore what is coming up. In 2022, we're going to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle. And Coffee Fest for over 25 years has provided the best experience for specialty coffee retailers. Workshops, trainings, lectures, the show floor, the networking, the events, the competitions. This is an incredibly enriching experience, but also an equipping one. I would definitely recommend you and your team take part in one of these shows coming up in 2022. Also, you'll see on the website CoffeeFest 365. That is CoffeeFest's new online learning platform. So I hope you check that out, and I hope to see you at one of these shows. I'm there at every show, giving lectures and judging latte art, and just having a good time with you. So again, go to coffeefest.com to learn more. And with that, that is the end of our show today. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to join me. Subscribe to the show, share these episodes with a friend. Have an amazing day. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.